This video will review factoring of binomials, and in particular, use that factoring of binomials and the zero product property to solve quadratic equations, particular types of quadratic equations. Use the square root property to solve quadratic equations, as well as to use completing the square along with the square root property to solve quadratic equations. First, let's take a look at reviewing factoring of binomials. What we found out is that if we wanted to factor something that looked like a squared plus b squared, then we knew that the factored form was prime and that we could not factor it. But now that we know a little bit more about complex numbers and stuff, we're actually going to find out that we can factor it into a plus bi and a minus bi. These are the complex conjugates. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But we also know that we can factor a squared minus b squared into the form of a plus b times a minus b. Again, these are conjugates, just not complex. So now let's do an example of factoring difference of squares. Let's say we have 16x squared minus 49. Well, what we do know is that we could imagine that this 16x squared as something squared and that 49 as something squared as well. So we can do that. We're going to see that 4 squared is 16 and 4x squared is going to be 16x squared. And 7x squared is equal to 49. Remember, this is our a value and this is our v value. Those things that are inside the parentheses. So our factored form would be thinking it as a plus b and a minus b. So if we do our factors, we're going to see that we're going to have 4x and 4x, which makes sense because when we're multiplying 4x times 4x, we're going to get our 16x squared. And our b is going to be 7. That makes sense as well, because if we're going to multiply 7 times 7, we're going to get our 49. So now we see that we need one of them to be plus and one of them to be minus. The reasoning behind that is because we want, when we finish multiplying on the inside, we're going to get 28x. And when we multiply the outside numbers, we're going to get negative 28x. And when I add those up together, we get 0 or nothing. And that's the reason why we don't see it in our quadratic equation that we have here. So we have completed the factored form of that. The other thing we're going to do is talk about what if we're going to solve. So let's say we have example number 2 that says 16x squared minus 49 is equal to 0. So notice we have the exact same thing that we have up here in example number 1, except this one is set to equal to 0. So let's go on ahead and factor. In fact, we already know the answers to our factored form. That's going to be 4x plus 7 times 4x minus 7. And it's still equal to 0. Notice we just use our factored form that we found up here. Now that it's equal to 0, we're going to talk about the zero product property. So the zero product property states this. It says that if you have a product, that means you're multiplying two things. We'll call that A times B, or whatever two letters you want to use. If we multiply them, the answer is what we call the product. And if it's 0, this is why this is called the zero product property, it says if you have these two things being multiplied and they equal to 0, then one of them has to equal to 0. I don't know which one, maybe both of them do, but at least one of them has to be 0. So we're going to use this thought so that we can solve our problem over here. So using the zero product property, if I kind of think of this as my A version of being multiplied and this as my B version of being multiplied, then we can sit there and say that 4x plus 7 is equal to 0. or 4x minus 7 is equal to 0. Then we have two linear equations that we need to solve, so we're just going to solve them by subtracting 7 to both sides. And then we'll get 4x on the left, and on the right we'll get negative 7. We're going to divide both sides by 4, divide both sides by 4, and we're going to find that x is equal to negative 7 over 4. We're going to do the same thing on the other equation. We're going to add 7 to both sides, and we're going to find that we get 4x is equal to 7. We're going to divide both sides by 4, and we're going to find that x can equal to positive 7 over 4. So our solution set for this equation is two answers, negative 7 over 4 and positive 7 over 4.